Have you ever thought the nosy neighbor who nitpicks about your lawn or garbage cans couldn't possibly cross the line into actual crime? The kind of neighbor who hides behind HOA rules and fines just to make everyone's life miserable? If I told you that the same HOA president who handed out violation notices for leaving a trash bin out overnight was secretly stealing her neighbor's mail, and not just once or twice, but systematically, thinking she would never get caught, because everyone was too afraid of her to say anything. This isn't just a story about petty HOA drama, it's about federal agents, sting operation, and the shocking moment an entire neighborhood stood outside and watched Karen, the queen of HOA power trips, being handcuffed and shoved into the back of a federal vehicle for mail theft. And you won't want to miss a single detail of how it all spiraled from small annoyances to a full-blown federal arrest. So before we dive deep into this insane, true-to-life tale, make sure you hit subscribe to Sham Stories right now, because this channel is where you'll find the most unbelievable HOA nightmares and neighbor from hell sagas you won't hear anywhere else. My name is Daniel, and when I moved into my new neighborhood, I genuinely thought I had found peace at last. After years of living in cramped apartments with thin walls and noisy neighbors, I was thrilled to finally buy a modest home in what seemed like the perfect community. The lawns were immaculate, kids played outside safely, and people waved politely when you drove by. The houses all looked picture perfect, like something out of a suburban postcard. And it didn't take long before I realized the reason everything was so orderly was because of the HOA at first. I didn't think much of it. I figured the rules were there to keep the neighborhood nice, and I was okay with that. But it didn't take long before I met Karen, the president of the HOA, and my whole perception started to shift. Karen was the kind of person who seemed to be everywhere at once. If you left your trash can out a minute past pickup, she knew. If you parked your car in the street for a night, she left a note. If your grass grew a quarter-inch too long, she sent you a warning. I brushed it off at first, assuming she was just overly dedicated to her role. But soon it became clear that Karen wasn't just enforcing the rules, she was enjoying the power. She had a smugness about her, a way of talking down to people as though she owned the block. Residents often whispered complaints about her behind her back, but no one dared confront her directly because she wielded the HOA bylaws like a weapon. For a while, I just tried to stay under her radar. But then something started happening that changed everything. My mail began disappearing. It started small, a missing letter here and there. At first I thought I misplaced it or that the postal service had made a mistake, but then it escalated. A birthday card my sister sent never arrived. An important bank statement vanished. A package that tracking showed as delivered was nowhere to be found. I reported it to the post office, but they insisted it had been delivered correctly. The thought was ridiculous at first. Why would anyone steal mail, especially in a quiet neighborhood like this? But then I remembered Karen, always watching, always meddling, always lurking around when the mail truck came. She had an obsession with control, and in my gut I felt that Karen was behind it. My suspicions grew stronger when I talked to my neighbor Jim one morning while we were both grabbing our newspapers. He casually mentioned that a package of his had gone missing too. Piece by piece, a pattern emerged. Missing mail wasn't just my problem. It was happening to multiple houses, and all of us lived within Karen's line of sight. The picture became clear, and it was disturbing. Karen wasn't just an overzealous HOA president, she was a thief. But suspicion wasn't enough. I needed proof, and that's where the story took its wild turn. One evening, as I returned home with groceries, I caught sight of Karen peeking through her blinds as I walked up to my door. It gave me chills. She wasn't even subtle about watching me. A few days later, when another expected letter failed to arrive, I knew it wasn't coincidence anymore. I decided to take action. I first contacted the local police, but they told me that stolen mail wasn't under their direct jurisdiction. It was a federal matter. They advised me to reach out to the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. Honestly, I didn't think they'd take me seriously. I figured they had bigger cases to deal with than missing birthday cards and bank statements. He asked specific questions. When did the theft start? What items were missing? Did I suspect anyone? Hesitated, then told him flat out, "I think it's my HOA president, Karen." For a moment there was silence on the line, and then he said, "We've seen this before. If you're right, she won't get away with it for long." That's when I realized this was bigger than I thought. Mail theft wasn't a petty issue. It was a federal crime, and the postal inspectors weren't going to play around. Within a week, Agent Miller showed up at my house in person. He was tall, serious, the kind of man whose presence alone commanded respect. He laid out a plan. They were going to set up a sting operation right here in the neighborhood. They would. If Karen took the bait, they'd have undeniable proof. My job was simple. Act normal, go about my routine, and don't let on that anything unusual was happening. Over the next week, I felt like I was living in a spy movie. Inspectors in unmarked cars rotated shifts parked on the street, blending in as best they could. I noticed them sometimes, their sharp eyes scanning the block, but Karen, too focused on policing everyone else, didn't seem to. Then came the day the trap was set. The mail carrier delivered as usual, leaving a stack of envelopes and a medium-sized package in my box. From my living room window, I pretended to be tidying up, while my heart raced as I kept an eye on the mailbox. It didn't take long. About 20 minutes later, I saw Karen coming down the sidewalk with her little dog in tow. She glanced around, pretending to let the dog sniff the grass, but her eyes flicked toward my mailbox. My stomach dropped. She walked right up, opened the box, and without hesitation, took the package and several envelopes, shoving them into her oversized purse. She did it so casually, so boldly, it was almost surreal. In that moment, I felt a mix of rage and vindication. She really was stealing mail, just like I suspected. But before I could even process the sight fully, an unmarked SUV rolled up from down the street. 2 plainclothes inspectors got out and strode toward her with purpose. Karen froze, caught like a deer in headlights. They identified themselves, flashing badges, and demanded she hand over what was in her purse. She stammered, tried to deny it, but they weren't buying her excuses. They took her purse, opened it, and pulled out the decoy package with the tracker. She turned pale. She tried babbling something about just keeping it safe, or neighbors leave their mail unattended, but it was too late. In full view of half the neighborhood that had come outside to watch the commotion, Karen, the almighty HOA president who loved nothing more than handing out fines, was handcuffed on the sidewalk and read her rights by federal agents. I stood, frozen at my window, watching the downfall of the woman who had tormented so many of us with her arrogance and control. Justice had come, swift and undeniable. But little did I know, this was only the beginning. Because once the inspectors searched her house and uncovered what she'd really been up to, the entire neighborhood would be shaken to its core. And Karen's reign of terror would be over for good, but not without more shocking twists along the way. When Karen was led away in handcuffs that afternoon, the neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. But what we didn't realize in that moment was just how deep the rabbit hole went, because the mail she had been stealing wasn't just a few letters here and there. Once the postal inspectors got a search warrant and went into her house, the scope of what she had been doing became almost unbelievable. And it turned our once peaceful suburban block into the center of a full-blown federal investigation that had everyone talking for weeks. I remember standing in my living room, still trying to process the sight of Karen being shoved into the back of a federal SUV, when my phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor Ellen. They're going into her house. I rushed to the window and saw the inspectors heading up Karen's walkway with boxers in hand. Warrant had clearly been issued quickly, and within minutes, they were inside. Neighbors began to gather in little knots on the sidewalks, whispering, pointing, and exchanging theories about what was happening. From the outside, Karen's house looked perfectly ordinary white siding. A neat little garden, a flag fluttering from the porch butt inside. The inspectors were uncovering something far darker. Later, when the details came out, we learned that Karen had been hoarding stolen mail for months, maybe even years. Entire closets were stuffed with unopened packages, letters, bills, checks, even prescription medication that was meant for other people. It wasn't just theft. It was a treasure trove of private information. The inspectors spread everything out on her dining table to catalog it all, and the sheer volume was staggering. I couldn't believe one person could accumulate that much stolen property without being caught sooner. But Karen had been clever in her own twisted way. She only stole certain items, enough to keep suspicions scattered, but not so much that the pattern was immediately obvious. But as soon as federal investigators pieced it all together, it was clear this was a calculated operation. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By evening, everyone knew Karen hadn't just been caught red-handed stealing my decoy package, she had been systematically targeting the entire community. Jim, my neighbor across the street, was fuming when I saw him outside. "She stole my wife's medication," he spat angrily. "She's been sick for weeks waiting for that prescription. And Karen had it sitting in her damn closet," Ellen chimed in, her hands shaking with anger. "My mother sent me a check for Christmas, Daniel. It never arrived. Guess who had it? Karen." Every person had a story, and the more we shared, the more disgusted and furious we became. The inspectors, for their part, worked professionally but quickly. They carried boxes of evidence out of the house, loading them into vehicles, while Karen herself sat in custody, being interrogated downtown. Some neighbors dared to walk closer, watching with fascination as the stolen goods piled up. At one point, I overheard an inspector mutter to another, "This is one of the largest mail theft cases I've ever seen from a single individual." It was surreal. The woman who had obsessed over our grass heights and garbage bins, the woman who'd fined me, once for painting my shutters a shade too dark, had been running a secret crime spree right under our noses. But what disturbed me most wasn't just the theft, it was what she could have done with the information. Bank statements, social security notices, medical records, all of it was in her possession. Identity theft was a very real possibility, and that thought sent shivers down my spine. Later, Agent Miller came by my house to update me. He explained that while Karen had been caught with a mountain of mail, they still needed to determine what she had done with the contents. "It's possible she was stealing just for control or spite," he said grimly. "But it's also possible she sold personal information. Until we analyze everything, we won't know the full scope." His words made my stomach sink. This wasn't just neighborhood drama anymore. This was potentially a case that could affect people's finances, credit, even their safety. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house made me think about Karen's shadow looming over the neighborhood, about how long she had been watching and stealing without us realizing. I kept replaying the image of her casually slipping my package into her purse, and the fury in my chest only grew. How many times had I walked past her with a polite wave, never knowing she was rifling through my private life behind closed doors? The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed like a hive. Clusters of people gathered in driveways, piecing together the puzzle of Karen's reign. Rumors flew. Some said she had been working with others. Some believed she was blackmailing people with what she found in their mail. Others swore she had been selling information online. None of it had been confirmed yet, but in a way it didn't matter. The betrayal alone was enough. Even the people who had once sided with her, afraid to speak up against her HOA rules, were now turning their backs on her. Suddenly, all the letters, fines, and petty rules felt even more sinister in hindsight. She'd probably fine people just to distract them while she was stealing their packages, Jim muttered bitterly one morning. It was hard to disagree. Days turned into a week, and the federal investigation kept peeling back layers of Karen's activities. The local news picked up the story, sending a van to our neighborhood with a reporter who stood on Karen's lawn and spoke about the shocking scandal in a quiet suburban community. Watching it on TV that night was surreal. My neighbors, even my own name, came up in the broadcast as one of the original complainants. For a moment, I worried about being thrust into the spotlight, but then I realized the more attention this got, the better. Karen's downfall wasn't just about justice, it was about warning others how far someone in a position of petty power could go. But here's where things took an even stranger turn. During the cataloging of stolen mail, investigators discovered patterns that suggested Karen wasn't simply taking things at random. She had organized piles of certain people's mail, tracking them almost obsessively. My name was one of them. In her living room, they found a box labeled Daniel that contained months' worth of my missing letters, magazines, and even old packages I thought had been lost forever. My stomach turned when I realized she had been singling me out more than anyone else. Agent Miller sat down with me one afternoon, his expression serious. "We believe Karen had specific targets in mind," he said. "For some reason, she focused heavily on you." My blood ran cold. Why me? I wondered. Is it because I ignored her HOA, nitpicking more than others? Because I refused to cower when she scolded me about my shutters or my trash cans? Or was it something deeper, something personal? I didn't know, but the thought of her going through my life, piece by piece, left me rattled. Meanwhile, the HOA itself was in chaos. With Karen behind bars, the rest of the board scrambled to distance themselves from her, claiming they had no idea what she had been doing. Emergency meetings were called, and for the first time residents felt emboldened. To speak freely, people who had stayed silent for years finally stood up and voiced their frustrations. One elderly man, Mr. Hawkins, shouted during a meeting, "That woman terrorized us with her fake authority while she was committing crimes the whole time." The HOA board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of how bad this looked for them. By the end of the week, Karen's position as president was formally stripped, and the board promised reforms. But trust had already been shattered. No one wanted anything to do with HOA leadership anymore, and whispers about dissolving it entirely spread like wildfire. And through it all, I couldn't shake the unease. Because while Karen was behind bars, the investigation wasn't over. Agent Miller warned me that charges were still being built, and depending on what they uncovered in her digital records, things could get worse. One afternoon, while I was raking leaves in my front yard, Ellen came running over with wide eyes. "Daniel," she gasped. They found bank account numbers in her files. Not just ours, people from other neighborhoods, too. That revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. Karen hadn't just been tormenting our community, she had been stealing from others beyond it. This wasn't just an HOA nightmare anymore. It was the unraveling of a much larger scheme, and I realized with a chill that the story of Karen's crimes was far from over. The weeks turned into months. Though Karen's arrest had been dramatic, and her removal from the HOA felt like a victory, the neighborhood remained unsettled because her trial loomed like a storm on the horizon, and everyone knew more details would surface once the prosecutors laid out their evidence. And sure enough, pre-trial hearings revealed shocking information that left us all stunned as the inspectors testified about the sheer scale of her theft. Not just a few letters here and there, but boxes upon boxes of stolen mail dating back several years, some of it unopened, some of it tampered with, and some of it destroyed, which meant countless residents had no idea what had been taken from them. And when word spread that Karen had even intercepted government documents, financial statements, and court papers, it dawned on everyone that her actions could have had life-altering consequences for people, from missed mortgage notices to lost medical appointments to delayed benefits, and that realization ignited a fresh wave of anger among neighbors who had once feared her but now openly despised her. And what added another twist was the discovery that Karen had apparently kept a meticulous journal documenting what she took and from whom, almost like she relished cataloging her control over everyone else. A journal that prosecutors now said would be used against her to prove intent. I remember sitting in my living room reading the article in the local paper, feeling both sick and vindicated because it confirmed everything I'd suspected about her need for control, her obsession with being the queen bee of our community. But it also revealed just how far she'd gone in her descent into paranoia and power-mongering. The HOA board, desperate to save face, issued carefully worded statements about respecting due process. But by then their words rang hollow, because the residents had lost all faith in them, seeing them as Karen's enablers, and a movement began to form to vote the entire board out at the next annual meeting, something that had once seemed impossible, but now felt like the only way forward. And I found myself pulled into the thick of it, attending planning sessions in neighbors' garages and living rooms where people talked about reform, transparency, and taking back our community from the shadows of corruption. And though I wasn't a natural politician, I couldn't resist the call because I had seen firsthand the damage that unchecked authority could cause. Meanwhile, whispers about Karen's personal life started to surface. Details that hadn't been obvious before because she had always maintained a pristine public image. But now cracks were showing, with reports that her husband had quietly moved out, that her adult children refused to speak with her, and that her finances were in ruins from legal fees. And while part of me almost pitied her downfall, I couldn't forget the image of her smirking as she controlled those board meetings, or the frustration of standing at my mailbox knowing she had stolen from me. So pity quickly gave way to a firm resolve that she deserved whatever punishment came her way. When the trial date was officially set, the media descended on our neighborhood, reporters knocking on doors, camera crews parked on the main road, and suddenly our once quiet cul-de-sac was the focus of local and even national attention, with headlines calling her the HOA male thief and neighborhood tyrant. And though most of us tried to avoid the cameras, a few outspoken neighbors gave interviews, describing her reign of terror in colorful detail, which only fueled the fire. And I knew Karen must have seen those reports from her lawyer's office or wherever she was staying, and it must have driven her crazy to lose control of the narrative, because for once she couldn't manipulate what people thought, couldn't bully us into silence, and that thought gave me a sense of grim satisfaction. As the trial opened, I attended one of the first days, sitting in the back of the courtroom as the prosecution laid out their case, presenting bags of stolen mail as evidence, each package tagged with the owner's name, and the sight was surreal, like walking into a lost and found apartment for an entire neighborhood. Except this wasn't lost, it was stolen deliberately, and the prosecutors hammered on her intent, showing excerpts from her journal where she had written petty notes like, "Took Susan's bank statement" or "intercepted Jack's lawyer letter," proving that this wasn't just casual curiosity. It was targeted and malicious, and though Karen sat at the defense table stone-faced, refusing to show emotion, I could see the tension in the way she gripped her pen, and in that moment I realized she wasn't invincible. She was just a person caught in her own web of deceit. The defense tried to argue that she had been overwhelmed, that she suffered from stress, maybe even mental illness, not that the mail theft wasn't malicious but compulsive. But no one in the courtroom seemed to buy it, least of all the jurors, who exchanged looks of disbelief every time another damning piece of evidence was presented. And by the end of the week, it was clear where the case was heading. Back in the neighborhood, the ripple effects continued, with residents both relieved to see justice unfolding and still shaken by the depth of betrayal. And it became a strange mix of community bonding and lingering suspicion with neighbors, checking in on each other more often, holding impromptu block parties, sharing stories of what they had lost, as if reclaiming a sense of unity was the only way to move forward. And though the circumstances were grim, there was also a strange silver lining in the way people began to look out for each other again, instead of letting the HOA dictate everything. For me, the trial became less about Karen and more about what came next for our community. And as I walked past her darkened house one evening, I thought about how much power she had held, how much fear she had spread, and how quickly it all crumbled once she was exposed, and I knew the ending of her story was still being written. But ours, mine, my neighbors, was just beginning, and we had a choice to rebuild stronger, smarter. Never again let one person hold so much unchecked power, and that thought gave me hope, even as the weight of her crimes still hung heavy over all of us. Karen's arrest may have been the moment that everyone in the neighborhood had been waiting for. But the aftermath was anything but simple, because once she was taken away in handcuffs and the police cars rolled out of the neighborhood with flashing lights, there was a stunned silence that blanketed the street as if no one quite knew how to process what had just happened. And in the days that followed, the entire community buzzed with rumors, questions, and a strange mix of relief and unease, as if the monster had finally been unmasked, but no one knew what the fallout would bring. And for me personally, I was both relieved and angry, because while it felt good to see justice being served, I couldn't shake the thought that Karen had been stealing my mail and my neighbor's mail for months, if not years, and that raised questions about what private information she had seen, what documents she had intercepted, and how much damage she might have caused without any of us realizing. And the inspectors assured us they would investigate thoroughly, that all of the stolen letters and packages they recovered from her house would be cataloged and returned. But the reality was that some things were gone forever, and that kind of violation leaves a scar, a lingering distrust that doesn't fade. Overnight, and as much as I wanted to move on, it seemed like Karen's shadow lingered over everything. The HOA board tried to act as though nothing had happened, claiming that Karen's arrest was a personal matter and had nothing to do with the association itself. But no one was buying that story because everyone knew Karen used her position as HOA president as a weapon, and even if the mail theft technically wasn't HOA business, it was clear to all of us that she had abused her authority in every way imaginable. And what made matters worse was that the board refused to remove her officially, even after her arrest, claiming they had to wait for due process, which infuriated residents who wanted a clean break from her influence. And so community meetings quickly devolved into shouting matches between neighbors, demanding action, and board members desperately trying to deflect responsibility. And I found myself at the center of it when several neighbors approached me asking me to step up, to speak for them, to push back against the board's reluctance. And though I wasn't looking to become a leader in HOA politics, I knew I couldn't just stay silent because Karen's abuse had affected me directly and I wasn't going to let her cronies sweep everything under the rug. Meanwhile, Karen's case was making its way through the system, and the federal charges of mail theft were no small matter. The postal inspectors explained to us that even a single count of tampering with or stealing mail can carry hefty fines and prison time. But in Karen's case, the sheer volume of evidence was staggering. Stacks of letters, small packages, and even legal documents were found hidden in her garage and basement. And it became clear she hadn't just been targeting me or a few unlucky neighbors. She had been systematically intercepting mail from nearly the entire neighborhood for years, which meant she wasn't just nosy. She was operating almost like a criminal enterprise under the guise of being a concerned neighbor. And though her motivations weren't entirely clear, the inspectors speculated she had been prying for information, holding grudges, and maybe even using what she learned to manipulate people within the HOA. She suddenly explained why she always seemed to know everyone's business before anyone else did. As weeks passed, the gossip didn't die down, but instead evolved into a kind of collective determination among the residents. And I remember one particular meeting where dozens of us showed up, packed into the small community center, voices raised, demanding transparency, demanding change. And that night, we voted on a motion to suspend Karen from her role as president until her case was resolved. And though the board resisted at first, citing bylaws and procedural rules, the sheer weight of community outrage forced them to concede. And for the first time in years, Karen's grip on the HOA was broken, though her presence still lingered like a stain no one could wash away. It wasn't just about stolen mail anymore. It was about trust, control, and the way one person had dominated an entire neighborhood with fear and manipulation. And as I walked home that night under the dim glow of streetlights, I couldn't help but think that while Karen was out of sight, she wasn't out of mind, and I wondered how long it would be before her trial, how much uglier things might get, and whether or not our neighborhood could ever really heal from what she had done. Some neighbors confided in me quietly about what had been stolen: medical documents, financial papers, even heartfelt letters from family that could never be replaced. The hurt in their voices made it clear that Karen's actions had cut far deeper than anyone could measure, and though the inspectors promised us justice, I knew that closure would be much harder to come by. Because justice in a courtroom is one thing, but repairing the fabric of trust in a neighborhood is another. And that was something only time could decide. As for me, I tried to get back to normal life, but normal no longer felt the same. Because every time I checked my mailbox, I felt a pang of suspicion, wondering if my letters were truly safe, if my privacy was truly intact, and each time I saw the empty house at the corner where Karen had once lived, lights off, blinds drawn, it was a stark reminder that even in the quietest suburbs there are secrets, lies and betrayals hiding behind pristine lawns and white fences. And though Karen was gone, her story was far from over. Because the trial loomed ahead, and with it the possibility that more truths would come spilling out. Truths that none of us were prepared for, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst revelations were still to come. In the months after Karen's sentencing, the neighborhood felt like it was breathing for the first time in years, as though the heavy, invisible hand that had once hovered over every lawn, every mailbox, every whispered conversation had finally lifted, and in its place there was sunlight, cautious but real. Yet even with her gone, the process of healing was neither simple nor immediate. Because people who had once been at odds, neighbors who had tattled to Karen, residents who had been coerced into silence, and families who had been direct victims of her schemes now had to figure out how to live side by side without suspicion. And that meant facing uncomfortable truths about how much control one person had been allowed to accumulate. Truths about how fear had kept people divided when unity could have stopped her much sooner. And I saw that reckoning play out slowly at meetings, at block parties, even at random chats over mailboxes, where people finally began speaking openly, not just about Karen, but about their own complicity, their own regrets, and while some still carried bitterness, most seemed determined to move forward. And in that sense, Karen's downfall became more than just the end of her reign. It was a turning point, a chance to redefine what community really meant. The new HOA board worked tirelessly to restore trust, adopting transparency measures like public budgets, open comment sessions, and rotating leadership. And at first, attendance at meetings was tentative, neighbors wary of whether things would truly be different, but as time passed and promises were kept, faith returned. And I saw people who had once sworn off involvement volunteering to head committees, organize block cleanups, or coordinate seasonal celebrations. And with each small step, the atmosphere softened, laughter returning to sidewalks, kids playing freely again, and slowly the tension that had once clung like fog evaporated into memory. Still, Karen's house sat at the edge of the cul-de-sac like an open wound, dark windows staring out at us like eyes unwilling to close, and though the property was tied up in legal battles, everyone knew it would eventually be sold, yet there was an unspoken agreement that whoever moved in would inherit not just a house but a story, one they might never fully escape, because Karen's name had become shorthand for corruption and abuse, whispered like a ghost story at late-night gatherings. And though part of me wanted the place torn down, erased so we could truly move on, another part believed it was important. It remained a silent reminder of what unchecked power could do. On quiet evenings, I sometimes walked past and remembered the fear of her notes, the sting of her accusations, the cold dread of wondering if I was next. And those memories didn't vanish, even when the street buzzed with life, because trauma leaves fingerprints that time can fade, but never fully erase. And yet, even with that shadow, I knew we were stronger for having endured it. That the bonds forged in resistance were sturdier than the walls she had tried to build between us. Life marched on, birthdays celebrated, gardens replanted, expenses repaired, and with each passing season, Karen became less of a daily presence and more of a legend. Cautionary tale residents told new families who moved in, often in hushed tones by fire pits or during HOA orientations, always ending with the reminder that vigilance mattered, that silence was dangerous, and that no community was immune from the lure of control if people weren't willing to speak up. For me, the experience changed how I saw not just the neighborhood, but life itself. Because I realized how easily small acts of complicity could grow into systems of fear, how important it was to question authority, and how crucial it was to defend the dignity of others even when it seemed inconvenient. And in many ways that knowledge became my guide going forward, shaping how I interacted with my neighbors, how I voted in local elections, how I taught my children about fairness and courage. Sometimes I thought about Karen herself sitting in prison and wondered whether she ever felt regret, whether she lay awake at night replaying her decisions, or whether in her mind she was still the victim, misunderstood and persecuted. But in the end it didn't matter, because the impact of her choices was carved into the lives she had touched. And that reality was hers to carry, no matter how she rationalized it. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, no place ever is, but it was free again. And that freedom was worth everything we had endured, a reminder that communities, like people, could be broken and remade, scarred yet still alive, fragile yet unshakably resilient when tested. And as I think back on the long arc of it, all the fear, the tension, the unraveling, the trial, the sentencing, and the slow climb back to normalcy, I realize it's not just a story about one woman's downfall, but about all of us, about what happens when ordinary people decide enough is enough, when when silence gives way to solidarity, and when justice, however delayed, finally comes crashing down. It's a story that matters not just in our cul-de-sac, but anywhere people live together. Anywhere power tempts corruption, anywhere neighbors must decide whether to turn away or stand tall. And if you followed this journey through to the end, let it serve as both a warning and an encouragement, because the next Karen could be anywhere. And the strength to stop her lies not in one hero, but in many voices refusing to be silenced. And if you believe stories like this real, raw, dramatic, and human need to be told, then make sure you don't miss what comes next, because every neighborhood has a story. And here at Sham Stories, we bring them to life. So hit that subscribe button now, join our community, and never miss the next tale that could change how you see the world around you. The final stretch of Karen's trial unfolded with the kind of intensity that gripped not only the courtroom, but the entire community. Because by then, everyone had invested so much emotional energy into the outcome, that each day's testimony became the talk of the neighborhood, whispered about in driveways, discussed at dinner tables, debated over text chains. And it wasn't just us watching anymore. It was the media too. Because the story of a suburban HOA president turned male thief had caught national attention, and reporters framed it as a symbol of what could happen when small-town power went unchecked, which only made the spectacle bigger. And on the morning the prosecution called its final witnesses, I found myself sitting once again in the gallery, my heart pounding as they unveiled perhaps the most damning piece of evidence yet: surveillance footage from the local post office, showing Karen making repeated visits to the back area where mail was stored. Footage that prosecutors said matched the dates when residents reported missing packages. And as the video played on the screen, the room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The image of Karen rifling through stacks of envelopes searing itself into everyone's mind, though her defense attorney objected, claiming the footage was circumstantial. The impact was undeniable, and I remember looking at the jurors and seeing the subtle nods, the tight-lipped expressions, the way their eyes hardened, and in that moment I knew the case was sealed. But still, the defense tried to mount a counterattack, bringing in a psychologist who testified about obsessive-compulsive tendencies, suggesting Karen's theft wasn't malicious but symptomatic of an untreated condition. And while some in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, I felt no sympathy, because the sheer organization of her thefts, the detailed journaling, the way she had used stolen information to pressure and intimidate neighbors, it wasn't the behavior of someone out of control. It was cold, calculated, and deliberate, and that was the point the prosecution hammered home in its closing arguments, reminding the jury that mental illness didn't excuse harm, and that Karen's victims had suffered real consequences. From lost financial opportunities to damaged reputations to unshakable feelings of violation. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the air in the courtroom grew thick with anticipation, and the hours dragged on, with people pacing in the hallway, porters scribbling in notepads, neighbors like me nervously sipping bad vending machine coffee as we waited. And when word came that the jury had reached a verdict in under 4 hours, the speed spoke volumes, and as we filed back into the courtroom, the silence was deafening, broken only by the shuffle of papers as the foreman stood to deliver the decision, guilty on all counts. The words landed like thunder, echoing through the chamber. And though Karen sat expressionless, her face pale, her hands clenched, I felt a wave of release, a collective exhale from the residents in the room. As if justice had finally spoken after years of fear and manipulation. Outside, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust in faces, neighbors giving emotional sound bites about vindication and closure. And though I slipped away quietly, avoiding the cameras, inside, I felt a surge of something close to triumph, not because I enjoyed her downfall, but because truth had prevailed over deception, and that mattered more than anything. Yet the story wasn't quite over, because sentencing still loomed. And that became the next focus of both the community and the media, with debates raging over what punishment was fitting for someone like Karen, whether prison time was justified, or whether restitution and community service would be enough. But for those of us who had lived under her rule, there was little debate. We wanted accountability in full. We wanted a sentence that matched the depth of betrayal, and as the date approached, the tension once again mounted. On the morning of sentencing, the courtroom was packed, residents shoulder to shoulder, reporters lining the aisles, and as Karen was led in, still defiant in posture, though visibly worn down, the judge spoke at length about abuse of trust, about the corrosive effect of power misused, and about how Karen's crimes were not victimless, but cut deep into the fabric of community life. And when he delivered the sentence 5 years in federal prison, along with mandatory restitution to victims, the room erupted in a murmur of relief, some even clapping before being silenced by the bailiff. And though no punishment could undo the damage, it was enough to restore a sense of balance, to remind us that no one, not even the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, was above the law. Walking out that day, the sunlight felt different, lighter somehow, as if a shadow had been lifted, and neighbors exchanged looks of recognition, nods of solidarity, as if to say we had survived something together, something that had tested us and changed us. But as the weeks passed, the aftermath settled in, and while Karen was gone, her house sitting dark and foreboding like a monument to arrogance, the community still bore scars, some residents still dealing with the fallout of lost documents, some struggling with lingering distrust of leadership. And that was when the real work began, the rebuilding of trust, the reimagining of what our HOA could be without the iron grip of a tyrant. And though it wasn't easy, it was possible, and slowly, piece by piece, we began to stitch our neighborhood back together, holding open forums, electing a new board, with people who promised transparency, organizing volunteer efforts to repair not just fences and gardens, but relationships strained by years of division. And through it all, I realized that Karen's downfall, as painful as it had been, had given us a chance to reclaim our voice, to rewrite the story of who we were as neighbors. Yet, even as life moved on, her shadow lingered, because the cautionary tale of Karen became a part of our collective memory. A story told at new residents' barbecues, a reminder whispered in HOA meetings whenever someone tried to overstep, a symbol of what happens when control morphs into obsession. And though I tried to put it behind me, there were nights I still walked past her empty house and felt a chill, a reminder that power once tasted rarely fades quietly. And I couldn't help but wonder if she still thought of us from her prison cell, still fantasized about the power she had wielded, still believed in some corner of her mind that she would return one day. But for now, the gavel had fallen, the sentence had been handed down, and the neighborhood, for the first time in years, felt like it belonged to us again. Not to Karen, not to fear, but to the people who lived there, who had endured, who had stood together when it mattered most. And that, more than anything, was the true victory we carried forward into whatever came next. The discovery that Karen's thefts went beyond our neighborhood sent shockwaves through everyone who had already been reeling from her arrest. And suddenly it wasn't just about our missing packages or stolen checks anymore. It was about a massive criminal pattern that tied our suburban drama into something far bigger. And that realization kept me awake at night because I couldn't shake the thought that if she had gone this far without being caught for so long, what else might she had been doing behind closed doors that none of us even suspected? By the time the second week of the investigation rolled around, the inspectors had uncovered evidence that Karen had intercepted mail from multiple zip codes, some as far as 2 towns over, which meant she wasn't simply targeting neighbors she disliked. She had been prowling other neighborhoods too, and the more they found, the more sinister it all seemed. One inspector told me privately that Karen had gathered not only personal mail, but sensitive documents like W-2 forms, tax returns, and even small business checks. That was when the possibility of identity theft moved from speculation to a near certainty. The neighborhood reacted in waves, at first shock, then anger, and finally paranoia. People lined up at the local post office demanding P.O. boxes instead of relying on home delivery. Some residents even installed cameras focused solely on their mailboxes, terrified that someone else might pick up where Karen left off. Every time a stranger drove down the street, whispers started that maybe Karen hadn't been working alone. I could see the fear taking hold, and though part of me felt vindicated that Karen had finally been stopped, another part felt guilty for ever doubting myself when I first suspected her. Because if I had spoken up sooner, maybe less damage would have been done. Agent Miller seemed to sense my unease when he visited again. Sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee in his hand, he leaned forward and said, "Daniel, I want you to understand something. People like Karen thrive because neighbors convince themselves they're overreacting. You didn't overreact. You noticed what others didn't. That's why we were able to act before this spiraled even further." His words gave me some relief, but they also made me realize how close we had come to never catching her at all. The inspectors were piecing together Karen's motives, but the picture was complicated. Some things pointed to pure spite hoarded. Magazines, birthday cards, and small packages she had no use for but seemed to enjoy keeping away from others. Other evidence, like financial documents, pointed to a calculated attempt to exploit information. The duality made it hard to pin down whether Karen was a criminal mastermind or just a vindictive busybody who let her obsession spiral into crime. Either way, the damage was undeniable. One evening, Jim invited a group of neighbors to his backyard for an informal meeting. We sat in a circle of lawn chairs under the dim glow of string lights, venting our frustrations. "She humiliated me for years over my lawn," Jim said bitterly. While she was sitting on stolen medication and checks inside her house, "The hypocrisy is unreal." Ellen nodded furiously. "She'll fine me once for leaving a holiday decoration. Up to long." Meanwhile, she was committing federal crimes. How did we let her run this neighborhood for so long? There was silence after that question, because none of us had an answer. Karen had ruled with intimidation, and we had allowed it because it was easier to comply than to fight back. Now with her gone, we were left to face the fact that her power had been an illusion all along. Still, as much as I wanted to move forward, Karen remained a looming presence even behind bars. The local news followed the story obsessively, and one night a newscaster reported that Karen had refused a plea deal and was demanding a trial, insisting she was innocent and had been set up by jealous neighbors. I nearly choked when I heard that. Set up. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. I wondered if she really believed her own lies, or if she was clinging to denial as her last defense. Agent Miller, when I asked him about it, just shook his head. "People like her rarely admit wrongdoing. Don't worry. The evidence is overwhelming." Still, I couldn't help but feel a knot of anxiety. The trial would drag everything out, put our private lives on display, and force us all to relive the nightmare. The thought of taking the stand against Karen, of having her stare at me across a courtroom, made my skin crawl. Round this time, strange little details began surfacing that only deepened the sense of unease. One inspector mentioned finding notebooks in Karen's house where she had written down observations about neighbors when they left for work, when their kids came home from school, even when they received certain deliveries. It was as if she had been keeping dossiers on everyone, and when I heard that, my blood ran cold. That explained why she seemed to always know so much about our routines. She hadn't just been watching casually, she had been documenting us like a surveillance operation. Ellen, who lived closest to Karen, confessed that she sometimes felt Karen's eyes on her when she watered her plants, but she never imagined the extent of it. The realization that our privacy had been invaded so systematically left everyone rattled. It wasn't just stolen mail anymore, it was the violation of knowing we had been studied like lab rats by a neighbor we thought was just nosy. As weeks passed, the neighborhood tried to heal, but the scars ran deep. The HOA was a mess, meetings filled with anger and distrust. Many residents called for dissolving it altogether, arguing that Karen had abused the structure beyond repair. Others worried that without rules, the neighborhood would fall into chaos. I stayed mostly quiet in those debates, focused instead on cooperating with the inspectors as they continued to build their case. One night, while lying in bed unable to sleep, I thought about the first time I suspected Karen, how I almost convinced myself it was too absurd to be true. If I had ignored that instinct, who knows how much longer she would have continued. That thought haunted me, but it also steeled my resolve. I promised myself that if this ever went to trial, I would testify, no matter how uncomfortable it made me. Karen needed to be held accountable, not just for me, but for everyone she had hurt. Then came the next bombshell. A few days before Thanksgiving, Agent Miller knocked on my door with a grave expression. "Daniel," he said, "we've discovered Evidence that Karen may have attempted to open credit lines using stolen information. My stomach dropped. Whose? I asked, bracing myself. He hesitated, then said softly, yours, among others. My knees nearly buckled. The idea that she hadn't just stolen my mail but tried to invade my financial life made my blood boil. Miller assured me that none of the attempts had gone through, but the fact she had even tried was enough to make me feel violated all over again. He advised me to put a freeze on my credit and monitor my accounts closely. That night, I sat at my computer filing fraud alerts and wondering how far Karen's obsession with me would have gone if she hadn't been caught.
Ow.
The more I thought about it, the more I realized Karen hadn't just been stealing out of greed, she had been targeting people she wanted to control. Her entire personality as HOA president had been about control, and when rules weren't enough, she turned to theft. It wasn't just about packages or mail, it was about power. That revelation left me with a chill I couldn't shake. Even with Karen behind bars, her shadow loomed over every mailbox, every front porch, every resident who now double-checked their deliveries with suspicion. Our neighborhood would never be the same, and deep down, I knew the worst chapter of this story was still to come.